that their palladium rods were experiencing an effective pressure of 10 to the 27 atmospheres.
What? Welcome back to the dead grad student problem. This is part 2 of my reaction. If you haven't seen part 1, I'll pin it down below.
The thing is, the one they borrowed was a medical device, and so was normally used to measure large radiation spikes that might cause a health risk. It's really inaccurate for the low levels they were reporting.
That is exactly right. There are different detectors are used based on different types of radiation, but also the energy levels of the radiation. So even if you're dealing with just neutrons, there's radiation that's designed to detect. There are detectors that are designed to detect fast neutrons, and there are ones that are designed to detect thermal neutrons, which is a way of saying ones that have not been accelerated. The point is, you really need to use the right sort of detector for the job, otherwise you're just going to be way off.
And the thing is, they seem to recognize all these issues. They knew their readings were far too low. They say it in the initial press conference.
We have a relatively low rate of production of neutrons. Rate of generation of tritium and the rate of generation of helium-3 is only 1/1000th of what you would expect if the fusion reactions were those experienced in high-energy physics.
But of course, the media covering the story would not have picked up on just how significant that detail was.
Kind of surprised they said that without even anything else. Like, okay, we're showing this low, but this is but a low reading on this detector means which means the actual number of neutrons is really 1 billion times higher, or whatever the actual number is. But that's just bizarre.
Even the not dead grad student himself, Marvin Hawkins, acknowledged this issue as early as April 14th. This is a damning admission. It shows that they were not seeing what theory predicted, but rather than assume they had made a mistake, they made a huge leap in logic, and ran with the idea that maybe the theory wasn't fully correct.
Theories are made to explain experimental data. We have the experimental data and we see no theory for it yet, so they're going to have to rethink some things.
I mean, they are, but I don't know. This is kind of like one of those things, like you hear hoof steps that sound like they're coming from an animal, and this is somewhere in Texas, but you don't see what the animal looks like. Do you think horses, or do you think zebras? Which is more likely?
That means there's some additional physics going on in the material that we do not yet understand.
Could it possibly mean there's a mistake?
No.
Ooh, a flat, primed, ready to fire no. Didn't even take in or internalize that. He was ready to deflect that. Man.
Sure that it's right.
I'm sure.
It is a bold strategy to say the least, and one that they were forced to adopt because of their race to beat Stephen Jones. With this in mind, it does reframe Jones's work. Let's put aside the matter of priority for 1 minute. Steve Jones and his team are physicists. They know exactly how many neutrons they should be seeing, and have a state-of-the-art detector to do it.
And exactly how many neutrons it takes to get a lethal dose.
And they did a proper background test. His group was seeing literally just 2 neutrons per hour. Just 2.
Wow.
That is 10,000 times less than the already shockingly low number from Pons and Fleischmann.
That's actually kind of hard to measure. That's like, yeah, because it's background.
That amount should work out to just 1/1,000,000th of a watt. And that's where the distinction between the two groups lay.
Number one, there is fusion, cold nuclear fusion, at a very low level. Number two, the level is not enough to lead us to suspect heat. Therefore, my conclusion is that we don't have heat due to fusion.
I would say that cold fusion is hopeless as a source of energy.
Yeah.
This is a very, very critical difference, and the media coverage in the immediate aftermath did
2 neutrons per hour versus 4,000 neutrons per second. So we're talking, well over 1 million.
not do a great job of conveying this. Both groups are claiming something remarkable, but only Pons and Fleischmann are arguing this could be a new source of energy. To go back to Jones's favorite analogy, if his claim was $1, theirs was the national debt. He may not have been first, but his results certainly sounded more realistic.
That's funny.
Indeed, among physicists, Pons and Fleischmann were viewed largely as quacks, But this Jones fellow, well, maybe there's something there. Although certainly the most obvious problem, the lack of neutrons was not the only issue people saw with the paper. Take the tritium, the other radioactive product you'd expect to see after fusion. In their paper, they reported 10 to 20,000 counts per second. Compared to the neutrons, this was around 10 times as much. But it was still 1 billion times too small to correspond to the heat they saw.
Yeah.
It was also weird that they were seeing more tritium than neutrons.
It is, because it's a 50-50 shot. It could even be as simple as they don't know what they're doing as far as how to operate the detectors.
The 50-50 branching ratio means you should be seeing pretty much equal amounts. So where else could tritium come from? Tritium, just like neutrons, can be created naturally via cosmic rays. The difference, though, is that this only happens in the upper atmosphere, and even then extremely rarely. However, the U of U chemistry department isn't exactly a good baseline.
Tritium is also produced as rad waste. Nuclear power plants are cooled by water. Some of water is deuterium, and deuterium can absorb a neutron. Low chance, but it happens. And considering you're in a constant neutron flux and it's a water-cooled reactor, yeah, you're making tritium. In a heavy water reactor, you're making more tritium. And it's treated as liquid rad waste, and it goes through what's known as the Advanced Liquid Processing System. And that mainly uses filters and demineralizers to remove other radioactive contaminants. But the tritium itself, dilution's the solution. With water, you have it on site in hold-up tanks till enough of it decays away. You have it in waste hold-up tanks, you dilute it, and then once the concentration gets to low amounts, you can discharge it into seawater, which will dilute it even more. And the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has various limits on what's considered acceptable, all of which are very conservative. But yeah, that's the other way to make tritium, is in a nuclear power plant byproduct.
Labs that often deal with radioactive materials will leave behind radioactive contaminants. Heavy water, although primarily deuterium, will have tritium in it a few times higher than the normal background level. Not to mention, another common lab material is something called tritiated water, where all the hydrogen atoms have been replaced with tritium.
It's so interesting to me just seeing, because it's still H2O, and it's chemically the same. I mean, it's denser. We're dealing with water.
It's a notorious contaminant that will get into the air if you're not careful. If you haven't assessed the tritium background before running the experiment, how do you know where the tritium came from? Let's go back to the main reason this is even supposed to...
This is like fundamental science stuff about establishing a controlled environment before running any sort of experiment.
...work at all. Palladium absorbs deuterium like a sponge. So much deuterium packed so tightly causes astronomical pressures, at least according to Fleischmann. Let's give you a frame of reference.
It's a lot of pressure, but fusion-inducing, no.
1 atmosphere of pressure is what most of you are breathing right now. The bottom of the ocean is around 1,000 atmospheres. And the pressure in the core of the sun is 100 billion atmospheres. And yet, Pons and Fleischmann claimed that their palladium rods were experiencing an effective pressure of 10 to the 27 atmospheres.
What? Okay, forget fusion. Are these guys making a black hole? Or some kind of extreme vacuum bomb? I mean, we're talking nuclei collapse at these pressures. Fusion would be far more ready than what you would see in stars. And you could smash quarks, get neutron star level of compression with these melted down quark soup, gluon plasma stuff. Forget dead grad student problem. We're talking dead anyone in I don't even know how many mile radius of this thing. It really depends how much of an area is at that sort of pressure. But yeah, no known material on Earth can withstand that. The only thing that could, we're talking neutron stars and black holes. That's the order of magnitude we're talking about here.
By compressing deuterium gas, D2.
Somebody dropped a zero somewhere.
Between 10 to the 26 deuterium gas, D2. Then you would need between 10 to the 26 and 10 to the 27 atmospheres of pressure.
Him even saying that reveals how ridiculous this is.
That is 10 quadrillion times more than the core of the sun. This is such a baffling number and should have been a major red flag to either of them.
Crimson.
Once again, this was a detail announced in their initial press conference, but the media reporting on it would not have picked up on the absurdity. As it turns out, they had made a basic mistake. They had used the wrong equation. When the correct equation is applied, the pressure in their cells is only 15,000 atmospheres. Higher than ambient, yes.
Lovely.
But still far, far too low to enable fusion. But perhaps the most outrageous omission from their experiment was a basic control test. The most primitive control they could have run.
Yeah.
Instead of using heavy water, use light water. Use hydrogen instead of deuterium.
Just basic water.
If heavy water produced excess heat, and light water didn't, then it was solid proof that fusion was behind the heat.
Or you could at least start going down that rabbit hole. By itself, I wouldn't make any unsubstantiated claims just yet.
But if light water also produced excess heat, it would suggest that there was some sort of mistake.
Or if it produced more heat. How about that? It produced heat because I turned the faucet on high. There you go.
In their heat measurements. Pons and Fleischmann had simply not done a light water control. Yeah. We know this because Fleischmann was asked this exact question by the director of CERN, Carlo Rubbia, at a publicly recorded talk. This is the actual audio of their exchange.
Martin, if you don't allow me to do that, by asking you a direct question, namely, all this is done with deuterium in the water. Did you ever try to do the same experiment, replacing deuterated water with ordinary water? If you do so, what happens?
I must confess to you that those experiments are just going on now, and we will hope to give you that answer very shortly. The reason we haven't done so is that if you do that experiment, you do in fact ruin the electrodes, and we have so far had very limited resources.
Those who were
You could tell that's bullshit. Wow.
present recall that several people gasped. His answer effectively boils down to, we didn't have time or money. But this just doesn't line up.
No.
They have said repeatedly that they started
How bad's their water bill?
experiments in 1984, almost 5 years ago, and they didn't run a light water control even once? In the press conference, he said this.
We have tried very hard to prove ourselves wrong, all the way down the line.
Evidently, they didn't try hard enough. According to Marvin Hawkins, they didn't start running light water tests until late April, almost an entire month after they had announced to the world their breakthrough discovery. On April 9th, Stan Pons will claim that he ran light water controls. We know this because Chuck Martin, a good friend of Stanley Pons, called him up about an experiment that he had run.
What had happened was that Chuck Martin was doing experiments with both heavy water and light water. We now know what was incorrect with that particular experiment, that he had a bad earth connection to a thermometer, so power was entering the cell through the thermometer and heating it up, which was not, of course, in the book balancing. And he called up Stan Pons this weekend, immediately before that date, and said, we're seeing heat with heavy water, we're really excited. And Pons said, that's great, I knew that somebody was going to reproduce it soon, I'm glad it was you. And then Martin said to him, but we have a problem, we are also seeing heat with light water. And Pons said, that's the most exciting thing, we see it too.
That's awesome. There you go. Protium fusion. You guys did it. You don't even have to enrich your water. That's awesome, isn't it? Though you should also be careful when you're drinking from the tap, because you might start a fusion reaction.
When he's asked if he's run a light water control at the ACS meeting in Dallas, he responds, quote, a baseline reaction run with water is not necessarily a good baseline. We do not get the total blank experiment we expected. It is a cryptic way to answer that question, but reading between the lines, one can imagine that he was hoping for a different result. Later, on April 20th, Nature will publicly refuse to publish the paper submitted to them by Pons and Fleischmann, as all three of its reviewers have been highly critical, and they focused in on the lack of a light water control.
Wow.
If they had truly been working on this for 5 entire years, how had they not once run a light water control. Pons was indignant. Quote, "I'll argue that the control is taking a palladium rod that absolutely does not work and place that side by side to an experiment that is, in the same solution, and that is a control experiment. It's never done anything that did at you. This is nonsensical. You can only know that a palladium rod doesn't work until after you've tested it, by which point it can't be a control. Unless there is some measurable difference between the working and non-working palladium, this is worthless." And on April 25th, the Wall Street Journal will report that Mr. Pons says he has a plain water experiment producing small, unmeasured amounts of heat. In summary, we really have no idea what their light water result was because Pons and Fleischmann don't seem to know either.
The referees in that journal, that is the people who decide whether to allow that article to be published or not, said they needed more information. The Utah group said, hey, listen, we don't have the time, we don't want to go through the trouble right now to provide you with information, give us our paper back, we won't even be bothered.
He also got Gary Triggs to send Nature a threatening letter. In a move that likely stung quite a bit, Nature did say that they would publish Stephen Jones's paper. A mistake is not the same thing as fraud.
Yes.
You can unknowingly make an error.
Big difference between being negligent and knowingly submitting bad work. Big difference in the consequences, too.
Find out later that you made a mistake, the proper course of action is to come out publicly, admit it, and either retract or correct it. Embarrassing, yes, but certainly not unethical.
No.
Where it turns into fraud is when you deliberately try to cover up that mistake. Just a couple weeks after their paper was published, they released an errata, adding the name of Marvin Hawkins. But in that same errata, they also changed a graph. They did not provide a reason why. If they had, it would have raised alarm bells. Unfortunately for them, at least one person had been paying close attention.
The guy from MIT.
On May 1st, a Boston Herald story is printed that quotes MIT physicist Ronald Parker, calling the work, quote, scientific schlock and possibly misrepresentation and maybe fraud.
Oh boy.
A few weeks earlier, Parker's group had attempted to repeat the experiment, but hadn't seen any evidence of neutrons.
Our analysis indicates it's likely that many, many fewer neutrons were observed than claimed, if any at all.
Although they said they would keep at it. But this headline was a clear step up from the previous statement. Parker, likely fearing that he might get sued, later tried to deny that he said any such thing despite his interview being recorded. Given Pons' tendency to sick Gary Triggs on people, he was probably right to be worried.
MIT is used to being right on top of every scientific discovery. Just as it happens, that increases their frustration.
But his reason to suspect fraud seemed to be justified, thanks to a tip from a colleague named Richard Petrasso. Petrasso had stumbled onto a highly suspicious piece of data in the paper. In his eyes, cold fusion was a ridiculous claim. It was, quote, just glib bullshit as far as we know. The only piece of evidence that made him remotely interested was the gamma ray spectra.
It's not wrong.
Fusion is supposed to emit neutrons. That much you know by now. Because they were short on funds, Pons and Fleischmann borrowed a low-sensitivity neutron dosimeter. All this detector could do was count neutrons. They don't tell you anything about where those neutrons came from. If we could measure the energy of those neutrons, we could be far more certain they're coming from fusion. And so, we want to look for gamma rays. Gamma rays are high-energy photons, typically emitted by a radioactive source. By measuring all the gamma rays in a lab, you can plot them on an energy spectrum. It will have a sloping background level with lots of distinct peaks jutting up. Each peak is associated with well-known energy levels. This peak at 1.46 MeV, for instance, comes from radioactive potassium, which is present in the environment and also your body.
I remember doing experiments like this where you'd have a mixed or possibly unknown source, and then you take a spectrum of them. Basically, you have a detector that not only counts them, but is also hooked up to a bunch of electronics that essentially map the energy levels of each individual peak. And yeah, you can figure out what it is. That's one of the labs. It's a pretty common lab that's done in nuclear engineering class on, I think the class was called just measurement and detection of radiation. But yeah, it was a lot of fun. Obviously, anyone in this field should know how to do.
Same with this peak at 2.62 MeV. which comes from radioactive thallium. There is also a peak that can prove fusion is occurring. When a neutron is emitted into a water bath, it will gradually slow down until it collides with a proton and become captured by it. This emits a gamma ray, and its energy level is extremely precise.
So water acts as a moderator for neutrons. It slows them down to the point where they can interact with matter. And that's why water is used as a moderator and a coolant in a lot of types of nuclear power plants, because it's doing double duty of increasing the odds of causing fission, whereas a fast neutron would just blaze on through.
It is 2.224 MeV with very little wiggle room. A gamma ray from fusion should look like this, a peak at exactly 2.224. And in the paper published by Pons and Fleischmann, that's exactly what you see. A peak in almost the exact right spot. Except there was an earlier draft of this graph. In both their submissions to the Journal of Electroanalytic Chemistry and Nature, they had submitted a graph with a peak way to the right, at 2.5 MeV. There is no relevant radiation phenomena that occurs at 2.5. It is just straight up the wrong value.
Yeah, that could be anything. I can't say I know off the top of my head what all the individual peaks are. There's a few that come to mind, but 2.5 MeV, that doesn't mean anything to me.
Pons and Fleischmann might have realized this if they had asked even just one colleague in U of U's physics department. Indeed, if the Journal of Electroanalytical Chemistry hadn't...
That's another thing. Get it reviewed, get other experts involved. That's another reason why you do that. But nah, these guys were in a hurry. They had something to do.
Rushed the peer review process, they would have sent it out to a reviewer with knowledge of nuclear physics, who would have caught this problem and likely rejected the paper. Ultimately, though, the graph with 2.5 was never made public, because on March 28th, Fleischmann was giving a talk in the UK at Harwell Labs, and the audience members there immediately recognized the peak as a mistake. Later that day, he told Pons over the phone, and Pons then submitted a new graph with the peak moved to 2.22. Not just that, though. The y-axis had been scaled from 20,000 down to 2,200, just 10% of what it used to be. In the facts he sent to Nature, he did not explain the reason for this correction. This, of course, is all behind the scenes.
This is some Ninovnium levels of shenanigans right here.
Not public knowledge. When the paper was eventually published, the only hint that something had changed is that an equation still had 2.5 in it. Without knowing that the graph had been changed, people thought this was just a typo. Richard Petrasso initially thought the same, but fortunately for him, he happened to have friends who worked at Nature who had seen the original graph, and they let him know that the peak had changed. Now, Petrasso thinks that there is something highly suspicious going on, but beyond that, the new graph had other problems. For one, it was far too zoomed in. Sure, there may be something at 2.22, but unless you can see the full range of energies, you can't tell if it's a signal or if it's noise. The shape of the peak also looked weird. It's about half as wide as it should be. And there are distinct features that were missing to the left of the peak.
That's right, they don't have the Compton edge here. So yeah, straight out of Compton. So yeah, your gamma ray collides with an electron and it transfers some energy to it. And this scattered gamma has less energy than the original gamma because some of it's now carried away by the electron. So this little edge here that you see just to the left of 2 MeV is the highest energy that the electron can have. I mean, this is a spectrum. We're talking about a range of gammas hitting all sorts of stuff in your target. So this Compton edge is the highest energy the electron can have because it got scattered at 180 degrees, which is the maximum, hence the sudden drop-off after the Compton edge occurs.
There should be a slope known as the Compton edge. And even further left, there should be a bump known as the first escape peak. The Pons and Fleischmann graph lacked both of those. Petrasso wondered...
They doctored it. They made it look too pretty, basically, to see if they can fool anyone. Wow.
If there was a copy of the full spectrum somewhere. Luckily for him, Pons and Fleischmann had let a bunch of Utah news stations come in and film their lab. And so, he went and scoured every news clip he could find until he found a clip from CNN. In it was a computer screen with the full spectrum.
Yep.
Because he knows exactly where the peaks for potassium and thallium should be, Petrasso was able to scale the rest of the spectrum.
Wow.
And lo and behold, when he looked for the so-called fusion peak, it was at 2.5 and not 2.22.
That's a good peer review, even when the other person, even when it's an unsolicited peer review and you're looking at something without their axes labeled. Okay.
Petrasso began phoning people at U of U to get more info. He even sent a student to Salt Lake City just to see if any more news channels had more footage. Marvin Hawkins confirmed to Petrasso that the peak was originally measured at 2.5. But he wasn't the only person who backed that up. Pons had needed help with the gamma ray measurements, and so he had asked a medical radiation physicist named Robert Hoffman to perform them. In fact, Hoffman, just like Hawkins, had his name left off the paper at the last minute.
Interesting.
A move that felt like a personal slight. After the press conference, Hoffman refused to work with Pons and Fleischmann ever again. Hoffman later ran some new tests and came to the conclusion that an issue with the preamplifier in the circuit caused artifacts in his spectrum. He wrote a letter on April 27th to Pons where he stated that there was no evidence for anything at 2.2 and that the 2.5 peak was an artifact. He was essentially retracting his data from their paper despite being left off as an author. Petrasso was outraged. With no explanation,
hence the ending of the previous video about how they... Yeah, okay.
Pons and Fleischmann appeared to have fabricated a critical piece of evidence. He began to write a paper lambasting them, which he would later submit to Nature. He was reportedly so angry about this that the original draft of his letter was so emotional, he needed a colleague to help him tone it down. Nature will reach out to Pons for comment, and after he doesn't reply for weeks, they gave him a deadline. His response was apparently so volatile, Nature declined to publish it. Petrasso's paper is published on May 18th. It will be a crushing blow to Pons and Fleischmann's credibility, an indisputable smoking gun.
Yeah.
Gary Triggs will later attempt to block the paper, but this amounts to little more than idle threats. But Petrasso's paper wouldn't matter. That's one of the ironies of this story. Scientists knew just how damning the gamma rays were, but to the media, it was just one of a dozen other criticisms flying around. Really, the media only paid attention an entire year later, when a book by Frank Close exposed the behind-the-scenes shenanigans, and he heavily implied fraud, or at least as far as UK libel law allowed him to.
I then spoke to Marvin Hawkins, the graduate student, and he didn't know either. And I said, let's get this straight. I said, it's clear that the peak was measured at 2.5. There are 4 people involved in this experiment. Fleischmann doesn't know how it's moved. Hoffman doesn't know how it's moved. Now you're telling me that you don't know how it's moved. And he said, I think you've got the picture now.
But by that point, it didn't matter. Cold fusion had been dead for a year.
5 laboratories have successfully repeated the experiment. 6 others have failed.
Tonight, other scientists at MIT and elsewhere are saying they have evidence suggesting there was no fusion.
For now, at least, the skeptics seem to outnumber the believers in the San Francisco Bay Area, where so many top-ranked scientists work.
And a Duke scientist says the problem with Pons and Fleischmann's work is that it amounts to sloppy science versus reproducible science. 2 groups of scientists at the University of Michigan announced today that they have found no evidence to confirm claims of a fusion reaction.
It all comes
back here in this country, a spokesman for the Los Alamos labs is denying earlier reports that scientists there were close to repeating the experiment.
Weeks earlier, lab after lab announced that they had confirmed part of cold fusion. But by now, just as many labs had declared the exact opposite. They couldn't see enough neutrons, tritium, or any gamma rays. For physicists, any of those 3 would be the gold standard proof of fusion. And yet they...
Or specifically a combination of these in the correct ratios. But sure, the fact they couldn't find anything, that just tells you they're not even remotely close.
Did not see them. But for chemists, the most compelling piece of evidence had always been the calorimetry, the heat. After all, if we go all the way back to 1985, we have the original piece of evidence that was so convincing, so unambiguous that it swayed both Pons and Fleischmann into believing they had seen something nuclear. The mythical meltdown. A 1 centimeter cube of palladium had melted and left a hole in the lab bench and concrete. They could think of no chemical reaction that could cause so much damage, produce so much heat. It had to be nuclear. But the thing is, no one actually
Nuclear melts stuff down, right? Like in 3 Mile Island. Sure.
Witnessed the event itself. All we know is that the cube melted.
But no one's
By this
around to
point,
hear
plenty
it.
of theories had been put forward that weren't so mythical. If you have a partially enclosed container that is slowly being filled with oxygen and hydrogen gas, and a bunch of it leaks out of the palladium all at once, all you'd need was a rogue spark, and you'd go up like the Hindenburg. And as we saw before, at least 2
Hydrogen,
labs,
yeah.
Livermore in California, and North Carolina U, called off their experiments because they had explosions. And their conclusions were that they had accidentally caused traditional chemical explosions. Nothing nuclear about it. Pons and Fleischmann have said repeatedly they could not think of a single non-nuclear explanation for the heat that they saw. They'd had 5 years to ponder this issue. Maybe they just lacked imagination.
Or they were just so zeroed in and they really wanted something. They were so focused they couldn't comprehend of something that wasn't consistent with what they believed.
Even besides the meltdown, Pons and Fleischmann said that they had seen 300% excess heat. 4 watts out for every 1 watt in. It was those numbers that made the news. Those numbers that convinced the world the era of fossil fuels may come to an end far sooner than expected.
Even if it was taken at face value, that amount of an energy increase over what you put in, that's still not necessarily groundbreaking.
But there was at least one chemist, one electrochemist in fact, who seriously doubted those numbers as well. Nathan Lewis was a 33-year-old professor at Caltech, with a solid reputation among his peers, especially for his age. Chuck Martin, a friend of both him and Stanley Pons, said, quote, "I'm not as young as Nate,
I like how interconnected all
nobody's
these people
as smart
are.
as Nate." He called him, quote, "one of the most fiercely competitive son of a bitches you'll ever meet." On March 23rd, when cold fusion was announced to the world, Chuck Martin had phoned Lewis's wife and frantically told her to record it on CNN. Nate absolutely needed to see this. Lewis's group at Caltech had been trying to replicate cold fusion since day one. Initially, Lewis let his postdocs do most of the work, as at first he was highly skeptical. He told them they were allowed at most a single day. But after talking to some peers and hearing more about Pons and Fleischmann, he figured maybe there was something to this. Quote, "They're a little flaky, but they're not crazy. I don't know what to think." What really got him interested was talking to a Caltech physicist named Steve Koonin, who told him about the extremely similar work by Steve Jones at BYU, who was known to be a fusion expert. The scandalous backstory there wasn't public yet, so to Lewis, this seemed like 2 groups independently stumbling onto the same thing. And so he directed his group to try and take a real crack at this thing. As the frenzy around cold fusion grew, Lewis's team grew to 15 chemists and physicists working side by side. Their neutron detector was around 100,000 times more sensitive than the one used in the Utah work. But they could only do so much when the paper lacked experimental details. There was no calibration data for the calorimeter. In fact, the paper didn't list even a single temperature reading. It only reported results in terms of watts of power. Lewis had...
That's also a red flag right there, a big one. Just not telling the whole story.
Personally emailed Pons asking for more info, even just a preprint of the paper. Pons called him and was friendly, but said he'd have to wait for a copy. Lewis asked for anything. Just anything he could give him, and Pons only gave him a cryptic warning. Quote, "Be careful. We've had explosions. I don't want you to hurt yourself. I want you to be careful."
That's ominous.
As for what to avoid, Pons only offered this. Avoid high current and sharp edges. Lewis and his group would have to push forward using their best guesses.
Yes.
Weeks go by and they see
important
nothing.
lab
And through the
safety tip
grapevine,
there.
they hear about some folks at MIT who think the gamma ray data is highly suspect. Lewis is convinced that this has all been a wild goose chase.
This is the Caltech cold fusion group, which of course was with the major anti-groups.
That's awesome.
But even at this point, he wasn't willing to go public against it yet. Steve Koonin had invited him to speak at the upcoming American Physical Society meeting in Baltimore. This was going to be the physics equivalent of the Woodstock-level meeting in Dallas. Lewis initially declined the offer, but one night, he stayed up late to watch the congressional hearing on C-SPAN. It was there he saw the University of Utah ask for $25 million for unproven research. And it was also where Fleischman divulged a piece of information that had not been public before. A comment so innocuous that no one in the room caught its significance. But Lewis did. And it was so offensive that he decided he couldn't sit back anymore. He phoned Steve Koonin back. He was going to speak in Baltimore, after all. Dallas had managed to attract 7,000 chemists into a basketball arena. APS in Baltimore would manage just 2,000.
Probably the most amount of chemists
it is no
that's ever been in a
Woodstock,
basketball
and
arena.
some likened it more to a political convention. But it will still go down as the stuff of legends. Steve Koonin gave one of the more memorable talks, and he had a dry sense of humor that played well on TV. Quote, "One could theorize about how pigs would behave if they had wings, but pigs don't have wings." He had been running computer simulations to see just how likely it was that deuterium would fuse at room temperature. He found that even with a deuterium ball the same size as the sun, only one fusion was likely to occur in an entire year. To end his talk, he did not mince words.
Wow. Theoretically, I would say that the BYU results are dubious, but not impossible. My conclusion is that the current situation is gloomy, but not yet terminal, and one needs a few more sensitive experiments to decide what's going on. Let me then turn to the Utah experiments. My conclusion, based on my experience, my knowledge of nuclear physics, and my intuition, is that the experiments are just wrong, and that we're suffering from the incompetence and perhaps delusion of Drs. Pons and Fleischman.
Throw down the gauntlet.
Now, by the standards of an academic conference, Koonin had dropped a bomb. But this was still a toned-down version of what he wanted to say. The Caltech lawyers had told him that whatever he did, he couldn't use the word fraud. He had warmed up the crowd, and they were hungry for the killing blow. In Koonin's words, if he had hit a triple, then Lewis was about to hit a home run.
Well, Steve, you really shook him up. Steve knows something about the experiments I'm going to tell you about, so he's a little justified. There are two pieces of news. Steve knows something about the experiments I'm going to tell you about, so he's a little justified. There are two pieces of news. One, I'm a chemist. Two, I'm an objective scientist.
He starts out with the questions many in the audience had been asking.
Sure.
Where are the neutrons? Where is the tritium? He also gets a small jab.
Basically, the fusion equivalent of Pixar, it didn't happen.
About the gamma rays.
We never saw anything above the background. And to prove that to you,
they actually measured the background.
The foreground, and I'll show you the whole spectrum, not just. And you see that we basically, if anything, see a little bit of negative peak in the 2.2 region.
But soon, he'd move on to the real issue in his area of specialty, the calorimetry, the heat.
Let's turn to heat. Heat is confusing to almost everyone, including almost all of my electrochemical friends, and I will try to walk you through this and you will be shocked. Guaranteed.
Calorimetry is not as simple as pumping in electricity and seeing the change in the water's temperature. You need to measure how fast the water is heating up. Accurate calorimetry needs a closed system. You have a box, and you make sure no heat is entering or leaving that box without being accounted for. Notably, the Pons and Fleischman cells were open-topped. And since electrolysis of heavy water generates deuterium and oxygen gas, it's fair to assume that not all of it will be absorbed by the palladium, and some of it may escape the cell into the rest of the lab. Now, this is not inherently flawed as a setup. In fact, compared to a closed cell, this is a much safer design that reduces the risk of explosions. As long as you're keeping track of the gases leaving the cell, your calculations can still be accurate. But Lewis argued
using something like a fume hood or some sort of ventilation would help just the buildup of hydrogen that could explode.
That Pons and Fleischman's math only worked out if you assumed that 100% of the gases escaped. However, in reality, some percentage of the gases will recombine back into the water, injecting small bursts of heat into the system. Lewis argued they had no way to prove that wasn't happening.
What's interesting is recombination of hydrogen is something that's actually used as a safety mechanism in a nuclear power plant. So one accident scenario at a nuclear power plant. During a loss of coolant accident, water reacts with hot reactor materials such as zirconium cladding for the nuclear fuel. And when it gets very hot, and by hot I'm talking well over 1200 degrees Celsius, zirconium interacts with water to generate hydrogen, which is volatile. So catalytic materials such as palladium are utilized to recombine hydrogen gas with oxygen in order to convert it back into water. They also give off heat, but that removes the hazard of a potential explosion within the reactor containment building. And again, this is all about fission, so it's interesting where the physics tends to overlap.
Another flaky assumption was that the temperature in the cell was uniform. Lewis argued that the cells could easily have hot and cold spots. Even something as simple as stirring or using multiple thermometers would help eliminate potential errors. Lewis gets a major laugh when he explains how his team got the dimensions for the fusion cell.
We built an exact cell as best we could from all the press photos that we had of the Pons-Fleischmann cell.
That's amazing.
We measured the ratio of their wrist to their arm and got a good scale length. We built the cell.
A fusion cell, half a cubit in length.
By far the biggest bomb dropped during Lewis's presentation was the realization he had while watching Pons and Fleischmann on C-SPAN.
Where do these last numbers come from? The 4-to-1 and 10-to-1. By the way, these last two numbers, the biggest two, are calculated in error even by their own formulas. This 1224 should really be only 306, and this 286 should really be 143. But that's not the real part. If you read the congressional record, and you look on C-SPAN, I told them that we knew this, and they didn't reply to me.
It is this moment right here.
One of the results which I'll show you, one of the sets of calculations which I'll show you on the next slide, and is really a hypothetical energy release. I'd stress that because it involves the recalculation of our data.
And he said it so casually, so quickly before moving on to another point that no one caught what he meant. But he had just admitted that the heat values, the 1 watt in and the 4 watts out, weren't measured directly. They were theoretical.
But Fleischmann pointed out, if you read it very closely, that the third column numbers were hypothetical, and he knew that we knew that. So he did point it out for the first time in public last Wednesday.
They had measured a palladium rod that was 1.25 centimeters long. But through some scaling process they did not explain, they extrapolated this result to a 10 centimeter long rod. So in their extrapolation, they could get 300% excess heat, but their average measured value was only 27%. Obviously, that's still in the green, but compared to 300%, this was a much, much smaller number, which meant there is plenty of room for error in the calorimetry.
Well, shoot, get a 10-meter long palladium rod cell and you can have a 10,000% increase. All right.
And instead of dividing it by the total power in, they divided it by an imaginary quantity. The current times an assumed voltage, half a volt. Not the voltages they measured, just the voltage they assumed. All of these were this numerator divided by
this is scary.
Fixed, arbitrarily
that they got this far and wow.
Chosen voltage. And so those numbers in the third column were scaled based on this arbitrary choice of half a volt. And that's where the 4-to-1 and 10-to-1 that are reported in their paper come from. I just want to make sure that that is clear. So we have no evidence for neutrons. We have no evidence for gamma rays above background. We have no evidence for tritium production at any reasonable rates. We have no evidence for ambient helium, above ambient.
And see, they actually defined what these limits are. Yeah, above 100 neutrons per hour per cc. Yeah, tritium, because all these numbers above background, above what's acceptable within their devices, measuring tolerances. Yeah, in headspace. I like that.
We have no evidence for any excess enthalpy in our measurements.
As soon as he finishes, the applause is roaring. It lasts an entire minute. Lewis himself said that he felt like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Lewis had spoken quickly and with confidence, and he had plenty of quips to share with the media.
This experiment hasn't been reproduced by any national laboratory or any university yet.
Probably made this guy's career.
Without a good football team.
The Lewis talk was so devastating that around half the audience left the conference immediately after. An organizer tried to get them back to work. meaning they had more talks to listen to. One person shouted back, "We are getting back to work." Pons and Fleischmann, despite an extended invitation, declined to attend Baltimore.
Of course.
They were right to avoid it. An editor for Nature, David Lindley, called the conference, quote, "a hanging party lacking only its intended victims." Notably, Steve Jones did accept an invitation. If you remember, it was an abstract he had submitted to APS in February mentioning cold fusion that had kicked off this entire chain of events. By now, his set of talking points was locked in. His dollar versus the national debt. The flower growing versus the tree. He'd also taken the time to practice some limericks, poking fun at Pons and Fleischmann.
Last night upon the stair, I saw a man who wasn't there. He wasn't there again today. Oh, how I wish he'd go away.
I have no idea what this means. The rehearsed nature of his talking points helped to cover up the fact that he was extremely stressed from all the public attention and criticism. He was still being accused of stealing the idea, and was no doubt covering his bases with BYU's lawyers. One reporter from the LA Times said that Jones had lost 13 pounds in the past few weeks from stress. Still keen to assert himself as the rational cold fusion discoverer, at a panel of 9, including himself, he proposed a show of hands vote as to whether the group believed Pons and Fleischmann's results were real. The vote went 8-1 against. When he asked the same question about his own work, the vote was better. 6 in his favor, 3 against. His neutron rate of just 2 per hour was so low, some thought he had just measured a cosmic ray burst and was deluding himself. Others found his presentation tacky, a chance to grandstand with Pons and Fleischmann being absent. He even showed off his legally notarized logbook pages, which made him seem more interested in patent rights than figuring out any scientific truth.
Some of the physicists who heard Jones use that analogy say they don't think the sprout is a tree or a flower. They think it's a weed.
This was still the Pons and Fleischmann show, and Jones's attempts to redirect the spotlight were floundering. The APS conference threw a wet blanket all over Washington.
Today, White House Chief of Staff John Sununu was supposed to meet with U of U fusion chemist Stanley Pons, but Sununu canceled. To top it off, the House Science Committee was supposed to visit Pons' lab next week, but today the committee canceled.
When we look back on the history of this scandal, most point to Nathan Lewis's talk as the fatal blow. But many scientists had already chosen sides by this point. In an audience of mainly physicists, he was just reinforcing a view that many of them already believed. He wasn't the first to come out against, nor was he the most famous or even the most vocal. His presentation, while more interesting than your typical academic talk, would quickly bore the average person. Maybe part of it is that it feels satisfying in a dramatic sense. Here came a fellow electrochemist, willing to speak out against 2 of his peers. By the end of the night, CNN was running the story, and the tide was beginning to turn.
Scientists meeting in Baltimore have declared cold fusion studies at the University of Utah dead.
I think it's improbable in the Jones case, but not impossible. I believe that it's impossible in the Utah case. Either there's some secret ingredient or some uncontrolled variables that they're not telling us about, or B, that it's wrong. And I'd put my bets on the latter right now.
The number of experiments that have been done in the University of Utah is very few. I mean, it's incredible in 5.5 years they've done so little.
Tens of millions of dollars are at stake, dear sister and brother, because some scientists put a thermometer at one place and not another.
The Times remarked, the government would do better to put the money on a horse.
Whether you want to attribute it to Baltimore or the public's short attention span, the media decided that as of early May, cold fusion fever was over. Lewis's talk was held on May 1st. This graph of articles on a week-by-week basis shows that there was a massive plummet the week following the conference. And despite a small spike the week after, interest had died by June and would never recover.
It hit the cover of Business Week, Time and Newsweek in the first week of May '89, and I was told that this was the first time the same story had been on the front cover of all these since Kennedy's assassination.
Wow.
This is the last time cold fusion will receive this level of mainstream spotlight. Only local Utah media will continue to cover it with any consistency. But as one physicist said at the time, the corpse of cold fusion will probably continue to twitch for a while.
Yeah, what's the half-life on these stories?
I don't think he realized just how bang on he was.
What's happening here? Wow. I'm excited about part 3 of this. This is quite the adventure. Thanks again for the recommendation, and thanks again for watching. I'll see you next time.